Morning everyone, or afternoon whenever you're listening to this. It's Luke Kay from Action Coach, and we are on the Professional Liverpool Community Matters. And today the topic of discussion is HR. There's been lots of interesting stuff going on with HR, and actually stuff changing as we're recording this morning, or might change in terms of the furlough scheme and all that sort of stuff. So our guest or expert in the field today is Julia Edgerley from HR All. So welcome to the podcast or video, whatever you want to call these types of things. So we're going to be covering all different things about HR, about contracts, about furlough, about redundant, all different stuff like that. But firstly, just before we start, two questions. The first question is, just tell us a bit about yourself. So you've been in this business 13 years, got 30 years HR experience. Is that right?
Yeah, I started off in the NHS and moved to local government and then into a research council. I've done insurance, I've done pharmaceuticals, and my last job was for a global engineering consultancy. So I had quite senior roles within HR, but also my background is big system implementation. So I've worked with large companies implementing their HR payroll systems. My last job involved quite a bit of international travel, and I had 2 children, and it just wasn't feasible any longer. So I left it thinking it was a 5-year plan just to set up a HR consultancy, and here we are 13 years later, still doing it. So, and I really enjoy it, and I love it. I love it every day. So yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I was going to say, whenever obviously I've known you for quite a while now. Whenever we're talking about HR, you're really sort of enthusiastic about it and really enjoy helping people and working with companies.
Yeah, I do. I think it really, for my clients, when they're lost and they're not sure which direction to go in, it gives me a real good sense, a good feeling that I've helped them and we've resolved an issue for them. So yeah, it's good.
And then just before we crack into the good stuff, where's the best people to get in touch with you if they're interested in find out more? I'm sure you'll do an initial free consultation with them.
Yeah, of course. Always happy to have a chat with anybody, anytime. Yeah. So my email address is julia@hrall.co.uk, and my mobile number, because working from home at the moment, is 07907 978 696.
Cool. And you're on LinkedIn as well. People want to just drop you a message on there as well.
Julia Edgerley. And it's a bit of a strange spelling, Edgerley. It's Edgerley. Basically, wherever you can find a space, squeeze it near you.
I've been typing. Always kind of. Right, have I got enough E's in here? That's exactly how I think. Right, cool. So let's get into the thick of it then. So first of all, let's talk about contracts. And yeah, we're going to be discussing all different types of things. But firstly, why are contracts important? Why is it important for a business owner to make sure they've got the right contracts in at the the right time and all that sort of stuff?
Okay, well, basically the law changed on the 6th of April. It used to be that you had 8 weeks to provide a new employee with a contract of employment, but the law changed, as I said, on the 6th of April, and that contract needs to be in place either before or on the day that they start. Now, this is something I've always encouraged my clients to do in the past in any case, because if you turn up for a job and you've been there 2 months and then you get issued a contract of employment, there's no scope for negotiating what's in that contract. If you're not comfortable with one of those terms, then it's too late to do anything about that, because you've given up the job that you were already in, you're emerged into a company, and you've sort of by default accepted those terms as implied terms. You've pitched up at such and such time on every day, and you've worked for such and such, and you've been paid a salary. So you've basically accepted those terms without being able to see what they are and have no visibility on them. So it's always a good thing to try and get that contract out in advance. But there's a couple of things about that. I mean, it makes you look professional as well. It looks like you have taken the time to consider your business and consider your employees and produced a professional document that proves that the value of the business and that employee to the business. But more critically, it sets the expectation going forward. You know what the requirement of the job is, and the employer knows what the requirement of the employee. So there's other documents around that, like job descriptions, etc. But this is the critical legal document that you need to be employing people with. Yeah. I think contracts, as I said, they really make you look professional, but they need to contracts they're not just one document. They need to come with a covering letter. They need to come with lots of other bits of information as well around them, because they're really difficult to cover every eventuality in a contract, because otherwise they end up with 20, 30 pages long. So things like if you've got bonus schemes, etc., they possibly need a separate document so that they're not contractual to go with that. But again, it needs to go out as part of an offer letter, because people need to know what their bonus scheme is going to be.
Yeah, and just two questions I've got on that then. The first one, and my biggest gripe with when I'm working with my clients and then they don't contract employment and job description as well. And this is clearly what you should be doing. That, you know, I guess if you're doing the employment contract, it's gonna make you send that information out as well, because it's like, you know, 2 months in, they're like, oh, the employee's not doing this, this, and this. I'm like, well, have you told them? Well, no. Well, no wonder they're not doing it. It's frustrating. I guess a lot of the other stuff that doesn't go in the employment contract, the standard business stuff, that'll go into the company handbook as well, and we'll discuss a bit about that later on. Is that right?
Yeah.
Cool. So once an employee's in, so let's say I've issued this contract to the employee, right? Is that for life? Or I'm assuming as the business changes and things develop, I might need to look at changing that employment contract and developing that moving forward.
You should have your contracts reviewed every sort of couple of years, because employment law does change and best practice changes as well. And plus your business will have evolved. You might be a business which has only got one employee who's, say, a warehouse operative. In 2-3 years' time, you might have grown and have 20 employees or 50 employees, and one of those might be an FD. The contract that's suitable for your warehouse operative is not going to be suitable for your FD. Mm-hmm. So you will need to add things into it. So for example, if your warehouse operative left and you only had 1 week's notice in that contract, they're pretty, you know, you could probably replace somebody quite easily. Mm-hmm. But your FD had the same contract and he or she only had 1 week's notice, and they left after 1 week, you'd be really struggling. There's also things like if you take on sales staff, you might want to think about restricted covenants, having those in your contracts, which stops them from going to work for your competitors, from poaching your staff, from approaching your clients when they leave. With restricted covenants, you can't stop people from working in their totality. So you can't say you can't ever go and work for a competitor anywhere in the UK forever, because people do have to earn a living, but you can restrict that to ensure your business is protected.
So a restricted covenant is a clause that goes into that contract that then limits what that employee can do once they have left the organization. And that, like you just said, that might be that they can't work for a competitor in a certain geographical reason, and also, or if they go and start their own business, they're sort of contractually obliged not to poach, you know, take all the staff and go there. So how would that get? So I've got a couple of companies that that's probably going to be, you know, useful for. And how would you implement that, and how would you police that as well?
Okay, so they're actually, I mean, to be honest, they're quite difficult to enforce. They're there really just to focus the mind. An employer cannot take an employee to a tribunal for breach of those clauses, but what they can do is pursue it through the small claims court. So what I recommend to my clients is when they get a resignation letter through, accept the resignation and copy the restricted covenants from the contract into an acceptance letter saying, we accept your resignation, however, we remind you of these restricted covenants, and if we find you are in breach, then we will pursue them through the small claims court. The second thing to do is to then take those clauses and put them in a letter and write to the new employer saying, I believe Joe Bloggs is coming to work for you. He has these restricted covenants in his contract, which he has signed. We will pursue them if we find that either Joe Bloggs or yourself is in breach of these restricted covenants, because we have to protect our business. Now, the only thing then that you can do, if you do believe that it's happening, and I've got 2 recruitment companies that this is happening to at the moment, they are able to evidence that that there is a breach of those restricted covenants, and they are pursuing it through the small claims courts, because they can show how much business they have potentially lost by these individuals going and poaching the clients and poaching the work.
So would you be going after the employee that's left, or would you also, because you've let the company know that they've got restricted covenants and then they operate underneath that, you can go to both? Yeah. Interesting. And I guess the other thing that when we spoke earlier that you mentioned would be a good thing would be when they hand in their notice, you then just copy and paste that and say, by the way, you have got a restrictive covenant in your employment contract, just so they're clear on that, because they might forget. If they've been there 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, they're like, oh, I've got
Forgotten what the clauses are. They'll have lost the contract of employment. Loads of things can happen regarding that. But yeah.
Yeah. So just another question on updating contracts. So I guess you've got your stock contracts and you might update that for the new employee that's coming in. Is there any scope to update an employee's current contract that they've signed? For example, let's say they've been there for a year or 2 years and you're like, actually, I want them on a longer notice period now, or I want to change this or change that. Can you update an active contract, let's call it?
Yeah, of course you can. So, because businesses change, for example, we work with a lot of businesses who have shifts on, and those shift timetables might change, etc. Or they might want to introduce weekend working. So I work with a large insurance company. Just recently, they wanted to have staff coming in on a Saturday and then on a Sunday as well. So we have to go through a period of consultation with those staff to implement it. Now, consultation is a bit of a strange one. The law doesn't ever say what consultation needs to look like. It just says it needs to be effective consultation, but no definition of what effective is. So it can be a week, it can be 10 weeks, but as long as you're very proactive in doing it and you keep a paper trail to prove that you've done the consultation. So it's never sufficient enough to say, we're starting consultation with you, and then don't do anything else, and then the next thing they've got notice of implementation. But yeah, you don't necessarily have to issue a whole new contract. You can just issue an amendment to contract. So if it's just a change of working arrangements or a change of date when the salary is going to be paid, they don't need a whole new contract. They just need an amendment to that contract, which they just sign then.
Mm-hmm. And I guess this is a bit of an open question, or how long's a piece of string, but I guess if the employee sort of has to agree with the changes as well, and if they don't, then there's like, let's open up a whole can of worms, I'm guessing.
Yeah, but I mean, you can sort of force them through, but I mean, it would be good practice, obviously, to take into account any employee considerations. So when we were doing ones about working weekends, people were saying, well, actually, I've got childcare issues, I've got this, I've got the other. Now, they were quite a substantial sized business, so we were able to look to see how we could move staff around to accommodate some of that. Ultimately, though, if that's what works for your business and it's something that you have to do, you might have to make a tough decision as to what you're going to do with that employee if they cannot do the new working arrangements, whether it would be considered that they'd resign their position or whether you wanted to have a conversation about them leaving the business in some other way, under redundancy, whatever. It's a bit of a minefield, and I wouldn't want to sit here and say this is exactly what you need to do, because it will depend on the situation and
variables,
and whether they've got the flex in there to move people around to be able to accommodate that.
Yeah, what I was trying to figure out was if it was business critical, technically you can push it through, but you might have to go with redundancies.
As long as you've done the consultation.
Yeah.
So their recourse would be, if they lost their job as a consequence of this, would be to take it to a tribunal, and you would need to prove that you consulted effectively and gave them enough opportunity, and you took into consideration all their arguments and any suggestions that they made as to how it could be a little bit more workable for them and why that wasn't suitable for the business. You would need to present all that at a tribunal.
Okay, that's why they need an expert like you to go through that as well. Just doing that on your own could be pretty risky, I'm guessing. Okay, next, we mentioned a bit earlier on about what other like documentation's important to have in place. I think one of them things probably a employment contract, not employment contract. We just discussed that. A handbook, and make sure you've got a company handbook. What other, if I'm an employee and I want to protect my business, what other documentation or contracts or policies should I have in place in the business?
There's some that you need to have. So when I'm doing a contract of employment, and companies aren't big enough necessarily to justify having a handbook. So I sort of say, once you get over 15 staff, then you should be investing in a handbook, which has got a full suite of HR policies in it, as well as setting things out like your core values, your standard practices, etc., which would all be contained in the handbook. prior to that, if you've only got a handful of staff, there's a couple of things you definitely need. You need a disciplinary and capability policy, and you definitely need a grievance policy. And it's always a good idea to have an annual leave policy and a sickness absence policy, just so that they're not bulking out the contract of employment as well. As I've said, otherwise it makes it extremely long. But with handbooks, yeah, definitely once you get over 15 staff, again, you know, it allows people to know what's happening in the business. It looks like you've invested in them. You might have somebody who is pregnant who doesn't want to come to you to find out what their terms are, what their entitlements are, but they can go to the handbook and find that out themselves. You know, they might realise that they've done something wrong, and you know that they might be in a disciplinary situation, or they might need time off for whatever, dependence care. They can, or they might want to make a request for flexible working. They can go to the handbook themselves and see what that process is, as opposed to approaching the you know, it's fact finding for them, and just you know, allowing them to make decisions themselves before they approach the business to say, this is what I want to do. So handbooks are a good thing, but I don't think, I mean, I always say to my clients, you have them, but if you're a small business and you're just setting up, don't invest in them yet if you've only got 1 and 2 employees. Save your money, do it on a good, robust contract, and we'll do handbooks when you've got a bit bigger.
Yeah. So just a couple of questions on that, and a couple of thoughts. I guess when you've got the handbook, it sort of also protects the employer from looking like they're just being petty, or looking like they're, oh, I've asked it to this, and you're just saying, oh, why, you know, why? Well, actually, it's in the handbook. This is how we've, you know, how we've always run things, and how we run it here.
A couple of transparency as well. You know, this is the way that we're going to deal with things. Yeah, they are needed, but not necessarily for very, very small businesses.
Yeah, a couple of the things you mentioned then. So you said a capability policy. What's that?
So that's so the difference between disciplinary and capability is performance. So if somebody's done something wrong and it's not performance related, you give the warning that the misdemeanor warrants. So that might be anything from a verbal warning right up to dismissal on the grounds of gross misconduct. Say if it was theft, or you know, they thumped somebody, or serious breach of health and safety. With performance, it's slightly different. You have to go through all the warning stages. Now, ACAS actually says you can jump to a first written warning. I always encourage staff and my clients to start off with a verbal warning.
ACAS.
ACAS are a regulatory sort of body. Where was I going with this? So they have to go through each of the warning stages, set targets, allow that person to try and demonstrate improvement, give them the training that they need and the support that they need. And if they aren't reaching those targets after all that, then you can escalate to the next level of warning until ultimately they're dismissed if they're not reaching. So there's a difference between disciplinary and capability, but the warning procedure and the way that you sit down and hold those meetings are the same. So I do a lot of those with my clients. Some of them are very comfortable doing it themselves, and some of them, this is an unknown to them. They've never sat down, had those meetings before. So I go in and do a lot of hand holding and run those meetings for them. So I'll lead those meetings with the client in there, because I don't have the technical aspects. So if they might be talking to somebody who's got a very technical job but they're not performing those technical things, I can't necessarily talk about those, but I can run the meeting. So I need the client in there to be able to support me with that.
Yeah, the other document you mentioned was about values and culture. Is that grounds if somebody's like doesn't fit the culture? I guess that's a bit of a subjective issue, but
it is hard to prove those things. It is definitely, but we do get it. And you know, sometimes people just aren't a good fit into a business. You know, they might have come from a background where, I don't know, say for example, they've worked in local government and they're used to working around rules and regulations, and then they go and work for a media company that's very much more relaxed, and the two things just don't gel sometimes. And it's not that they're not capable of doing their job, they're more than capable, but culturally they're just not the right fit. So and there's ways of dealing with that. So that's not necessarily a capability matter, and it's not a disciplinary matter. I think it's having a frank conversation with somebody, saying, look, this isn't working. Can we have a frank conversation about how we can make this work for both of us, i.e. you leave the business, and what's the best way to make that happen, so there's no risk for the company if that person leaves the business.
One of my coaches always told me that sometimes the employee might not always like want to have that conversation. They know it's not right, but they're almost too scared, or they don't like have want to go and have that conversation. So sometimes it's actually, strong of the employer to go, look, seeing, you're not fitting in, you're struggling, or, maybe it's worth you, looking for another job. And then the employer's like, actually, yeah, you're probably right. I wasn't happy, the way this is worked here, whether it's too strict or not strict enough or whatever.
And particularly if there's a sum of money on the table as well, that makes it a little bit easier for them to go, because they've got that backup before they find another job.
Mm-hmm. And what about subcontractor agreements and policies like that?
Sorry, I interrupted you then. Yeah, absolutely critical. So if you're a business, in some respects, I have to say more important than the employment contract, if you're a business that employs subcontractors, what you don't want is someone coming back after being with you for 2 or 3 years, working on a subcontractor basis, and then you saying to them, actually, I haven't got any more work for you, being able to claim that there was an employment relationship and claim redundancy pay, 2 years of backdated annual leave, and you ended up in a tribunal. If you've not got that document in place that proves that there was no employment relationship, so it doesn't set out how, sorry, something's just popped up on my computer screen, what the payment structure is for each of those assignments are, that it says that you are responsible for your own tax and NI, that it's very clear that there is no employment relationship, that if work isn't available, the contract comes to an end, how we arbitrate that contract if it's in dispute, what happens at times when there's acts of God, force majeure, so that person can't do the job, so you've put somebody in to do a piece of work, but say there's a flood or coronavirus happens and that person now can't go and do the job. What happens? What payment is made? Is there any expectation that any payment should be made? What happens about equipment? How much equipment should they be provided? All those sort of things. And it's quite a substantial long document that I do, but it's very, very robust, and it provides every bit of protection that an employer needs. And I've got a client at the moment who, for years, I've been saying to them, you really need to have a subcontractor agreement in place. And they were saying, but they're my friends that work with me, it won't be a problem. And now it has become a problem because my client has had to let a couple of their guys go who were working on subcontractor agreements but didn't have the agreements in place, and now these people are claiming that they were technically employees. So
that seems like one, like, yeah, you're gonna have to use that when business is not going that well, or you're in challenging times, and if you've not got it in place, it could be pretty bloody costly, couldn't it?
It is. Well, the things is we possibly in a unique situation where we might be able to prove that these people were claiming the self-employment rate from the government through the coronavirus, and if they were claiming that, then technically they would have maybe thought they were definitely self-employed as an employee, because they've not tried to claim anything as an employee. I don't know. So it's just a little bit vague at the moment. We're in a unique situation, and the coronavirus has sort of superseded some basic employment legislation. So and there's no case law on how these things are going to pan out. So yeah, it is a matter of watching this space to see how that's going to work out.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Look, could become a minefield.
Yeah.
Cool. So I guess if we've got these contracts, we've got when people have worked, we're going to start to hold a lot of information about our employees over time, right? So GDPR came in last couple of years ago, whenever it was, a few years back. And how should a business owner be looking to store employees' data, and how does all that type of stuff work?
I mean, it is hard, particularly for smaller businesses. Long-standing businesses, they've got files and files of paper everywhere with employee data on. There's breaches of confidentiality there. It's how do you get data from that as well to be able to understand things like your turnover, your staff turnover, your sickness absence reports. There's a great deal of HR software out there, and I think a lot of businesses think it's designed for big businesses. It's a big investment. It's not. we're a third party reseller of a piece of software which is really designed for small businesses. It's very flexible, it's quite funky to use, all my clients are loving it, and it's really, really cost effective. So I would say once you sort of get between over 5, 6, 7 staff, it's something you really should think about doing, because first of all, it is GDPR compliant. You don't need paper lying everywhere. Secondly, it manages things like your sickness absence, your annual leave. You can store your documents, all your health and safety on there. It calculates things like maternity leave, all those sorts of things. And at the moment, with all this furlough going on, it does all your furlough reports. Everything is updated in line with current legislation and best practice. They are, you know, sort of quite critical things for businesses to have. Again, I know it's an investment for the company, but I think it gives a good image for that business as well, to say, look, you know, we're professional, we're invested in our employees. We're not going to be this fly-by-night, fly-by-the-pants sort of business that just keeps paper everywhere. We don't issue contracts. We've got the portals in place. We've got the processes in place. You know, we're a good company and we're growing, and we've got the basics to allow us to do that.
Yeah.
So, you know, if anybody wants to have a chat about HR systems and have a quick demonstration, I'm happy to do that. But there are plenty out there which, you know, on apps you can get free ones. They might not be particularly good, the free ones, but they are there if you want to have a look at them. And you get the support that goes with that as well. Yeah. And they're always updated in line with current legislation. So for example, you've got people on there, staff that are on minimum wage. You never have to think again about when minimum wage needs to be increased, because the system just does it for you. Great little things.
Yeah, I've got probably a few questions on that actually in terms of HR systems, but just before we go into that, because I think it'd be a good little piece. But when you said about employee data, like for us layman people, what employee data might somebody have? What, just the names and address and telephone number, or what goes into employee
details,
data?
Haven't you? When you start, you've got all their bank details, you've got their national insurance details, you've got, as well as name addresses, you've got their next of kin details, and then as they progress through the business, you've got their CV, you've got their contract of employment, and as they progress through the business, you might have done disciplinaries with them, you might have sent them file notes, you might have sent them thank yous, they might have had employee of the month, you know, all sorts of things. So the data just grows and grows and grows.
Notes maybe, or health issues, or when they've been away with family problems or bereavements and all that sort of stuff. So what you're saying is that rather than having that on the desk or a drawer, you know, it's really dangerous. Really, you know, even, you know, once you get over 2, 3, 4 employees, they should be using a robust sort of HR system. Yeah. So when we're looking at HR system then, or looking at choosing one, or what, so just going through again, sorry to just get you to repeat it, but what would they, what functions would they have? Can the employee access, would the employee have a login to that?
Yes.
As well?
Yes.
And what would be, I guess that's where the employment handbook would be stored as well. All the list of policies would be stored on that portal. So rather than, would that count? Would it count as issuing the handbook and the policies by giving them a login to the HR portal? That would count as issuing that as well, right?
And the great thing about that is that when, say, employment law changes and we need to update a policy. So what we do is we don't have one big handbook on there. We break it down into lots of different policies.
Yeah.
You can just update that one policy. And then you can, via the system, or even the system that we offer, it sends a text message out to all staff. One click of a button and every member of staff gets a text message saying, have a look at this policy. So, for example, we've just brought out a new policy regarding managing annual leave because of the furlough situation for several of our clients. So they've sent an alert out through the system to say, you need to have a look at this policy. Now we can monitor who has looked at that policy. We can see exactly who has gone and read that policy. It doesn't have to be HR policies. It can be health and safety policies as well. There's a portal on there that allows you to store all your health and safety documents and do all your risk assessments on it, etc. So if you've done a new toolbox talk or whatever that might be, I'm not health and safety, so that's a bit vague on all that sort of stuff. But if you've done something health and safety wise and you want to put a document on there, you can send a message out to everybody to say, here's our new health and safety statement, here's our new way of doing this, that, and other regarding, looking after going down confined spaces, whatever that might be. You need to read this. and it'll date stamp exactly when everybody has read it. So you can go back to the ones and say, why have you not read that? It was, it was a critical document. You need to read it.
Yeah, that's really useful, because employees can't go, well, I've not been sent it, show me the email. It's like, no, it's on the portal. This is what we've been told, that, oh, that's going to be updated, and you've had this text message and that, and you've, I guess, essentially not been bothered to read it, whatever. And I guess it standardized the documents as well that you've got across the whole business, because you've got that live working copy, and also yours will track when that's been updated and all that type of stuff. Yeah, that's pretty interesting, that, I guess.
There's lots of other things as well. I mean, you can do all your performance management, so all your appraisals through the system, so you've got the data on there rather than bits of paper on appraisals. People can track their targets, so you can have financial targets, but you can have other sales targets, all sorts of targets in there. It runs timesheets, so if you've got staff that clock on, clock off, it doesn't clock on and clock off, but you can run your timesheets through there, and they might be project-driven timesheets. So if your staff book time, if you're professional services and say you're in construction and you want staff to book time to specific projects, you can do that, and that can link up to your sales system, so that you know what times need to be booked out to deliver back to clients, etc. It does salary modelling. That's my favourite thing on it. A bit of a geek, but it's got a salary modelling thing on it, and you can simply go in and just go, you know what, I want to give everybody 5% and see what the bottom line of that is, and then go back to that and go, well, actually, John's only been here 2 months, so I won't give him a percentage. Chris has been an absolute star, so I want to give him 10%. Jane's really delivered as well this year, so I'm giving her 10%, and do all that modelling. And then once it's all done and you're happy with it, you press a button, it's all implemented. And it's through your payroll provider can see all that information as well. You can run a quick payroll report, drop it down into Excel, send it to your payroll provider, they can upload it, and it's all done. It's all done. It does all, if somebody's off sick as well, that appears on the payroll report. You don't have to think again. it's just all recorded, and it's just all done for you.
The other thing, the big thing that's going through my head when you talk about this is the what we call them PDRs or appraisals. So there might be something that's come up that you've mentioned in the appraisal every quarter, every month, that was a small thing that's then becoming a bigger thing. But then because you've only documented it when it's become a big thing, that might be the first evidence that you've spoke to them about it. Whereas if you've documented it over for 3 months and it was a small thing, then got bigger, and that's all saved on the portal, you've got that evidence. Whereas if you only document it once it's become a big thing, well, technically that's the first time you've formally mentioned it or got evidence that you've mentioned it, whatever.
If there's a problem with someone's performance, it shouldn't wait till the appraisal, because typically appraisals are only done once, maybe twice a year, so it shouldn't wait till the appraisal round. You need to deal with it when it happens. But you can also put file notes on there. So it might just be that you've had a very informal conversation with somebody about something, but you can put a file note on it, and you can either make it visible so that both parties can see it, or you can just keep it visible to yourself, so it's an aid memoir to say, actually, I have spoken to this person, I just need to think about it in a month's time or 2 weeks' time, just to go back in and just check to see how they're getting on with whatever that might be.
Cool. So next one then, we've discussed about redundancies, and there's the hot topic, COVID and redundancies, and I guess unfortunately you're seeing quite a lot of redundancies right now. It's not the nicest thing to talk about.
No.
How are you getting on with that, and what you're finding?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. There's, to be honest, there's a couple of companies that are using it to sort of get rid of the dead wood, the people that haven't been performing, but they haven't had enough to substantiate doing that going forward. But most people are doing it because they're in genuine reasons, and the business cannot sustain having that number of employees in there. I'm working with a company at the moment in the travel sector, and they're having to make 40 staff redundant, and they'll be left with 12 at the end, which is massive. They will recover, but it probably won't be for another 2 years that they'll be able to recover. And the sort of business that they are, they're very driven, very focused. They will build that back up, and I know that they will. And I'm just there to support them through that, and through that minefield, and make sure that they do it sort of fairly and ethically. And as I said earlier, I have clients that want me to sit in and drive that for them, or they might just want me giving the advice in the background. So the thing about employment law is actually quite simple. I find it quite simple in any case, but when you put people in the middle of it, then it gets very emotional. You don't know their backgrounds, the impact of that redundancy situation on that individual. So it's taking all that into account and dealing with that and dealing with the emotions around making people redundant. And sometimes it's really difficult in a smaller business for the manager to step back and to do that, in a very not unemotional way, but in a way that because they're so tied into that employee that they need someone impartial to come in and just do it in a little bit of a more matter-of-fact way to help them through that.
So just before we get into sort of like how you run them or what part you sort of play in that redundancy situation, so I guess if you're making someone redundant, you have to do redundancy pay. Is there any sort of layman's or if somebody's thinking about making somebody redundant, like how much is that going to cost them? Is it on how long time served? What happens if the business can't afford the redundancy pay as well? Like how does that minefield work?
So there's two elements to it. They get notice pay, and notice is dependent on how long that they've been in the business. So if they've got more than 2 years, if they've got less than a month's service, that they're not entitled to any notice pay. Between 1 month and 2 years, they get 1 week of notice pay, and then anything above that, they get a week every year of service, but capped at 12 years. So if they've been in the business 13, 14, 15 years, they still get 12 weeks of notice. And you need to take that into account with your planning of your redundancies as well. So if you do your consultation for 2, 3, 4 weeks, whatever that might be, and then you've got to give someone 12 weeks notice, you can either pay them pay in lieu of notice or get them to work their notice, but obviously you need to plan that out. And particularly at the moment, where people are being made redundant and we're able to pay redundancy, or not redundancy pay, but notice pay through the furlough scheme. So it's allowing them to claim back a percentage of technically notice pay by using the furlough scheme. So it's the planning of that, and that's what I help do. So the second element is the redundancy pay itself. And redundancy pay is calculated on several factors: your continuous start date, your age, and your salary. So there's a statutory redundancy rate, which I think is about £530 off the top of my head at the moment. If you earn more than that, it's calculated at the statutory redundancy rate. If you earn less than that, it's calculated at your rate of pay. And it depends when you started in the business and how old you are. So depending on how old you are, you might get 1 week of pay, half a week of pay for every year's service, 1 week of pay, or 1.5 weeks worth of pay. And obviously, it's such a movable feast. But the government website is really good. If you need to do some quick calculations, then you can, if you just Google redundancy calculator, the HMRC website pops up, and it's so simple to use, and you just put that data in and it tells you exactly how much redundancy pay you need to pay.
And then the notice period pay, that's not like a statutory figure, that's actually what they get, what they earn.
Yeah, it's based on their actual salary, but you need to take other things into account as well. So if they've got car allowances and other types of things, then you have to look at sort of what their regular pay has been. It's not just what their salary is. So if they've received regular bonuses, etc., you need to, it's not quite as simple as just this is your basic pay. So that's why you probably need to speak to someone like me as well to have an understanding of what all the elements are to do with redundancy. But then we make sure that obviously all the letters are correct, that people have got the correct entitlements in there, and sets out the process of the redundancy in that letter.
Yeah. So how does your role work in redundancy then? So let's say you're working with a client, or let's say somebody rings you up and says, Julia, don't work with you, but I think I need to make 4 people redundant. What's your role in all that, and how do you manage that process?
Okay, so it really depends on the client and how comfortable they are and whether they've been through that process themselves before. So if they sort of know what they're doing, they might just want me in the background as help.
And just to be clear, sorry, you work. We're talking a bit about employees in the future, but you work on behalf of the employer, not the employee in that situation. You can't sort of mediate or do.
No, well,
you can mediate obviously, but you're working on behalf of the employer, not the employee.
Yeah, there's a conflict of interest if I'm advising the employee and the employer, and that's not just in redundancy situations. If I was in a disciplinary situation and I'm advising the employer and I've got the employee coming and asking for advice as well, it just doesn't work. Slightly different in redundancy, whereas if I'm doing it on behalf of the company and the employee is asking what the process is and is coming to the table with suggestions on how they can save their job role, then obviously I'm working more with the employee, but always mindful that this is the given situation of the business, and you know, we're in a financial situation and that's why we've got to make these redundancies. So it is a bit of a balancing act with the two.
So how does what that look like then with the like, I guess there's a consultation period, timeframes around that. How does all that work, and what do you do when you're doing that?
So it really depends on the size of the business. So sometimes we might start off doing group consultation and then down to individual consultation, because obviously we can't talk about individual packages in group consultation. And sometimes we just start with individual consultation. So that is setting out the expectation on how the process is going to run. Obviously, it's a real shock for everybody when they're called into that meeting and they find out that the job's going to be possibly made redundant.
Mm-hmm.
So it's setting out the process, how long you're going to consult for, how the meetings are going to take place. So usually the meetings are face-to-face. In this situation at the moment, most of them are by Zoom. We ask whether they're happy with that. If they would prefer to have face-to-face meetings, we will do that as long as it's safe to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And then what's going to happen at the next stages. So during consultation, there's no right for the employee to be accompanied. But once we get to the meeting where we're actually we've made the final decision and we're giving them notice of redundancy, then they have the right to be accompanied by either a work colleague or a trade union rep, and that's a very formal meeting.
Yeah.
Now, there's no statutory requirement to give right of appeal. However, I always encourage my clients to do that, because I think it's just another tick box for you to listen to that final why they shouldn't be made redundant, and you can say, okay, we've really considered everything now. So if they do decide to take you to a tribunal, you've covered every eventuality. You know, you've given that last little bit of a safety net, that we've gone through this, we've listened to what you've said, we've gone over it again, you've brought additional information to the table. We feel safe now that we are making the right decision to make you redundant. So I'd always encourage to add an appeal process in there.
So there's going to be initial communication, then there's going to be one-to-one or group stages throughout that process, and then there's going to be a final decision, then an opportunity for appeal, and then it's going to be, yeah.
But always follow through everything that you've discussed in paper. So even if somebody's popped into your office and said, can I just talk to you about such and such, always follow it through in an email to say, you came into the office as part of the consultation, you discussed this, and this was our sort of response. So you've got it documented that you have had those consultation meetings with them, even if they were just not a formal consultation meeting.
Yeah. Now, a question: I've been told that if making people redundant, you better letting everyone know at the same time rather than doing two, then next week doing next two, because it can create sort of anxiety in the workplace. Is that your opinion, or what's your thoughts on that? Pardon?
I do get that. Absolutely get that, but sometimes that's just not feasible. So the company that I mentioned before that are making 40 people redundant, we've had to do it in phases. So we've said this is phase one. If anything changes, because we don't know what's happening with coronavirus. We don't know when restrictions are going to be lifted regarding travel abroad. So this is phase one. We're hoping that we won't have to implement phase two. You're a phase one person, so you're definitely made redundant now.
But in the terms of the phase one, you tell everyone that that's been in phase one relative at the same time, so that they know that everyone's going. Yeah.
We did a team consultation meeting and let them all know that they were, and then we had individual consultation meetings with them after.
Yeah.
A lot of businesses go ahead and inform the whole business that they're in a redundancy situation. And there's pros and cons to that as well, because then it allows other people to make suggestions on how that job role can be changed. However, there's also a bit of a breach of confidentiality as well, if it's only the one job role that's being made redundant. So we have to sort of think about those things. So it's never a cut and dry process. The one process doesn't fit every business. And that's why you need to speak to someone like me so that we can work out what's the best way to do it. So we're not breaching confidentiality. We're not making somebody embarrassed because they've been selected. But equally, if you're making lots of people redundant, how you portray that across the business so people don't feel uneased by it. What's going to happen? Am I going to be the next person? What are the key messages that you've got to get out there? We're doing it for this reason, and it's only going to affect this group of people because we've lost this bit of business. It's not across the board. Your jobs are safe. So there is a balance of the two on communicating redundancies across the business.
Just quickly before we wrap up, what's your advice for an employee going through that process right now?
Well, there's plenty of free advice out there for them. They can go to ACAS. ACAS is always helpful, and there's always Citizens Advice Bureau as well. If they want to take legal advice, that's entirely up to them. Obviously, they have to pay for it, but I would always seek the free advice first before going there. And if they do feel that they have been unfairly treated or unfairly selected, or the company hasn't followed due process, then their only recourse really is to raise that through a tribunal. But it would go to ACAS for arbitration first to try and sort that out with the business before it actually went to final
Cool.
tribunal. Oh, sorry, that's my dog snoring. Sorry. Did you hear that?
Just a little bit. It's all right. So, so we've covered loads of stuff there. Julia, thanks. Been interesting, from employment contracts to getting people started, redundancies and all that sort of stuff. So just before we wrap up, is there anything else you want to cover or final closing remarks?
No, just if anybody has any staff issues, any sticky staff issues that they're not sure how they're going to deal with, please just give me a call. I'm always happy to give some free advice in the first instance to help you over that hurdle, and then we'll have a chat about how we can help you going forward.
Yeah.
If you've not got contracts in place, give me a shout, because I wouldn't want anyone to be in a situation where they ended up in a tribunal and the compensation was escalated and higher than it should have been because they've not had a contract in place. For a relatively cheap thing to do, just do it.
How do they get in touch with you again?
So they can either phone me on my mobile, which is 07907 978 696, or email me at julia@hrall.co.uk. Sorry, I fumbled over that one, didn't I? But I'm sure you got it.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay then, Julia, that's it. Thanks so much for coming on, and I appreciate your time, and been lots of good stuff there. So thanks everyone. Over and out.